Hey home bakers, it's Jack here, bakewithjack.co.uk, bringing you your weekly bread making tip every single Thursday. And this week is part one of a three-part yeasted bread back to basics series. Ingredients. Roll that theme tune. Hey you guys, and welcome back to the Bake with Jack YouTube channel, where I share with you a little bit of my bread making expertise every single week to enable you to go out there into the world using your skills and your knowledge to make the best bread you've ever made. If this is your cup of tea and you've never seen my face before, consider clicking subscribe before you go. So I feel like over the last 110 Bake with Jack weekly bread tip videos, something may have been a little bit lost in translation. Here at Bake with Jack Towers, we deal with principles and knowledge to help you do your own thing with bread. You will find a few recipes here, start to finish, but most of what I do is try and share with you the knowledge that you need, because knowledge and experience and practice is way more powerful than a recipe by itself. That's what we tackle here at Bake with Jack. So without further ado, let's talk about part one of this three-part yeasted bread back to basics series. Part one is all about ingredients, and just hold on. You know we're getting serious when the kids' chalkboard comes out. Yes. Okay, here we are. When you're making yeasted breads at home, your ingredients fall into three categories: basic ingredients, extras, and what we will now call bits and bobs. So let's go through each one of these categories together and see what we can discover. Category number one, basics. This is what your bread dough is made out of. 4 ingredients: flour, salt, water, and yeast. 4 basic ingredients that are essential for your bread dough. Well, let's keep this simple with the top one: flour. Your basic foundation for yeasted bread at home is strong white bread flour. You can make a lovely white loaf of bread with 100% strong white bread flour. You're going to need around about ½ kilo for your dough to make a nice loaf of bread. The other one we're going to tackle today is brown flour, which is the opposite to white. It's brown flour, it's wholemeal, it's whole grain, whatever you want to call it, it's brown. White and brown. These two are pretty much interchangeable in terms of the properties of the dough will stay the same there or thereabouts. The only thing you've got to consider is the more brown flour you're going to need, the more water you're going to need, because everything will get a little bit tighter. And so for a loaf of bread for a beginner, if you were to use all white flour, you're looking around about 63-65% hydration, which will make a dough that I consider to be quite manageable. On the other end of the scale, if you're using 100% brown flour, which you can do, the bread itself is going to be heavier. It's going to be heavier than white bread alone. That's just the nature of it. You're going to need a little bit more moisture, and we're looking at working around about 70% hydration if you're using 100%. If you want to mix them up and do 50-50, you can do that absolutely fine and cut the water somewhere between the 2 hydration rates. Does that make sense? Feel free to have a play and experiment with those 2 flours. Quite a nice loaf that I do in class is 80% white flour and 20% wholemeal flour. And I feel like that's a real nice balance. You get the flavour from the wholemeal and you get the lightness from the white, and that's just the way that I'd like it. So with these 2 flours you can have a play and you can't really go too badly wrong. When we get into speciality flour territory, I'm talking about rye, spelt, that sort of thing. These things change the texture of your dough much more, and so it's not as easy just to swap out one for another in that scenario. Things get a little bit more tricky. Let's move on. The next ingredient on my list is water. Water is important because without it, your bread's going to be a little bit dry. Seriously, water brings everything together, right? Water is the key ingredient. The more water you have in your recipe, the slacker your dough is going to be. The less water you have in your recipe, the tighter your dough is going to be. And that's okay. Theoretically, the rule is the wetter the dough, the better the bread is going to be in terms of keeping quality, in terms of flavour, in terms of fermentation, in terms of moisture of the crumb. The bread is going to be better the wetter the dough is. However, if you can't manage a wet dough, don't do it wet. Do it drier. Take the moisture down in your recipe for next time to make it more manageable for yourself. Water's important. I get it out of the tap and use it for my bread dough. Room temperature is quite key depending on where you are on the planet, and I will link in the description below a couple of blog posts that I wrote about the temperature and how important it is. Salt is important. I use fine sea salt in my recipe. Salt is important. If you make bread without salt, one, it doesn't taste of anything. It's the weirdest sensation to put bread in your mouth that doesn't taste like bread. Salt is really important in terms of flavour. Also, if you make it without salt, things get a bit crumbly, hard to slice. I've done it, we've all done it by accident. Come on, it's hard to slice the bread. Things get a bit crumbly. The structure doesn't quite develop properly. It's all a little bit strange. Put salt in, it's important. As a rule, I used to do 10 grams for half a kilo of flour, and now I've cut it down to 8 grams for half a kilo of flour, which I don't find compromises the flavour much. Next up, yeast. Yeast is responsible for puff. Yeast is responsible for creating the gas that puffs up our dough. Yeast ferments the dough, creating two things. One, gas, which is puff, and two, flavour. Yeast comes in fresh forms and dry forms, and let's take a look at them both, shall we? This is what fresh yeast looks like. It comes in a cube and it's fresh, and we keep it in the fridge. I keep it in a box like this, lined with the paper that it came in. It's like this. It's a little bit crumbly. It's really, really lovely for a loaf of bread. For this, for example, I'll use half a kilo of flour and, as a rule, 12 grams of fresh yeast. Fresh yeast brings incredible flavour and incredible texture, which I do not believe is present when you make a bread with dry yeast. If you can't get hold of fresh yeast, please don't let that be a barrier to you making amazing bread at home. There is dry yeast that you can get in two different varieties. This one is called Easy Bake, or sometimes it's called Fast Action, Quick, Instant, Easy Blend Yeast, and it's a really fine powdered type of dry yeast. Can you see that? Hold on, beep, that's better. See that? This one is really fine one. There's another one that I can't show you, I'm afraid, and that's granules. It comes in the same tin like this, but it is granules. The particles are a little bit bigger and they require dissolving in water before you put it into your dough. This one, straight into the flour. See you later. As a rule, for dry yeast, for a yeasted loaf of half a kilo of flour, I'd go with about 7 grams. And this quite helpfully comes in a 7 gram sachet, so you can use 1 sachet per loaf if you want to. I do have a few issues with this yeast. First and foremost, yeast, the fresh one that you get, is just yeast. This one has got all sorts of bits and bobs that I could try and read and embarrass myself inside, but I'm not going to do it. Sorbitan monosterate, what is that? Is that normal? I don't know. Who knows? Which brings us on to the next category. This is exciting, isn't it? Extras. Extra number 1 is fat. Don't be afraid of the word fat. It's not a bad word. I'm talking about things like butter. I'm talking about things like oil, sometimes even lard. Fat in our dough brings softness and silkiness. It also brings flavour as well. Imagine a buttery brioche, for example, with a buttery flavour. A focaccia using olive oil, bringing the beautiful fragrance of olive oil to your finished bread. Also, as an extra added bonus, fat keeps the moisture into your bread for longer, therefore bringing it more shelf life. It makes the final bread softer and the finer bread moister, which enables it to last a little bit longer. Moving on, eggs. Eggs have got fat inside, right? Eggs have got fat inside, they bring softness, so they also bring lift. If you imagine an omelette, if you're cooking an omelette and then you put it on the grill for a bit and forget about it, and it big puffs up like a giant souffle, right? This is what I imagine is happening inside of our bread. Whether that happens or not, who knows, who cares? I'm not a scientist, but that's how it makes sense in my brain. Egg brings lift. If you make a nice sweet dough for a nice iced bun, for example, egg brings lift. Fat is there to keep it nice and soft, and the egg brings additional puff, making your bread lighter. Breads like brioche have a high portion of the water replaced with egg, and that's why it rises up so nice and soft, exactly like a panettone, for example. Milk is lovely too. Obviously there's fat in milk, and it brings a nice silkiness and a nice milky flavour to your final bread as well. If you make a bread with just milk instead of water, it brings a lovely, wonderful lightness and softness that wouldn't be there present otherwise. Now, if you're excited by category number 2, get a load of the bits and bobs category. Let's do the big reveal. Bang! Actually, you probably can't see that very well, can you? This bits and bobs category is everything I consider to be speciality ingredients, things that you fancy. Your imagination comes into play here. I'm talking about nuts, seeds, dry fruit, olives, cheese. I can't even read it. I wrote olives twice. What's that about? Chocolate. These are all the flavours, the things that bring flavour and the things that bring texture to an olive loaf or a sun-dried tomato bread. Stuff like this. Extra bits and bobs that you want to add to make it your own. I'm talking about a brioche compared to a chocolate brioche with chocolate drops inside. Hello, a wholemeal bloomer with apricots and pecan nuts ready for your cheese board. Things you want to add to your dough, things you want to put onto your dough, all these bits and bobs, that's up to you. You can use your imagination to a certain extent. Some things are not practical, but you'll find that out. Think of adding herbs to your dough to bring a nice fragrance. Think of adding little cubes of cheese, little molten bits of cheese inside of a loaf of bread. Wow. Steer clear of anything that might be a little bit too wet. Also, raw vegetables a lot of the time are a little bit iffy. If you imagine anything inside your dough is effectively steaming itself inside the dough as the bread bakes, you want to sort of avoid raw things like raw onions, for example. I think that would be gross. I'd rather slowly cook those onions, releasing the natural sweetness before I incorporated it into my dough to bring a nice, sweet, cooked, delicious onion flavour, as opposed to a steam, raw, slightly acidic. No, not feeling it. These, to summarise, are your basic ingredients for your yeasted loaf of bread. Flour, salt, water, yeast, they are essential. Essential. Extra things, fat, eggs, milk, I'm talking about oil and butter. These things bring new elements, new dynamics, new textures, new lightness. They open doors of new deliciousness inside of your bread dough. And these things that you want to add, well, that's just up to you, whether it's chocolate and hazelnut. Oh, man. Slow roasted cubes of sweet butternut squash, whatever it is that you fancy you want to have a play with, that's those things there. And there you go. This has been part 1 of a 3-part series of Back to Basics. I feel like we need to summarise these things in a great big bubble, because yes, there's 110 videos of me on here tackling a single issue, but sometimes I feel like the message gets a little bit distorted along the way. This is your ingredients. Part 1 of a 3-part yeasted bread Back to Basics series. Next week, we are back with the big 4 principles. The principles of your yeasted bread. The principles. Did I say principles? The principles. Those mystical, magical principles that give you the ability to just come up with whatever you fancy at the time and make it a success. Listen, thank you so much for being here and watching this video all the way to the end. I hope it's helpful to you. Please, in the comments box underneath, let me know how helpful it may or may not have been. Let me know things you want me to touch upon in the future. I'll be back here next week with another weekly bread making tip. You guys have a good one. I'll see you then. Bye-bye. There it is, part 1 of 3 of a yeasted bread Back to Basics series. I feel like we needed this. I could have gone into way more detail than I did in here. And if you are interested in what I talked about earlier, about how important temperature is, don't forget the 2 links for those 2 blog posts are in the description underneath if you want to learn more about how important temperature is. I'll see you next week for part 2.